My name is Mick Adams, and my psychiatrist suggested I keep this journal to express my thoughts and feelings. I had just gone through a traumatic divorce, and I was struggling to cope. The doctor advised me to write down my story, including what I thought and felt at the time, explaining that this would help me deal with my trauma. And it did help. After that, writing in this journal simply became a daily habit. Let me begin by saying that I feel like nothing more than a sad divorce statistic. I found out that my wife, KARI, had been unfaithful, and now I'm divorced. I suppose it mattered that her affair was with my boss, Justin Bosner, and that he had been blackmailing her, but for me, that wasn't the main issue. I couldn't get the image of them together out of my head. Apparently, Justin had gotten my wife drunk at a company party I couldn't attend and took advantage of her. He then took pictures and used them to coerce her into being with him several more times. I also became part of criminal statistics because I attacked him in a fit of rage and was arrested. Fortunately, I had a great lawyer, my brother, Tom, who managed to prove my temporary insanity, and I was acquitted. Later, my ex-boss tried to sue me for damages, but when the jury heard the full story, they didn't award him anything. In fact, I turned the tables and sued him for destroying my marriage. This time, the jury found him guilty, and I was awarded a six-figure settlement. After that, I sued our mutual employer for failing to enforce the moral conduct clause in the employee handbook, and I won a seven-figure settlement. Financially, I came out of this mess smelling like a rose, but I was still divorced and alone. KARI had been the love of my life for 8 years. Life with her had been as close to perfect as any husband could hope for. It was only by chance that I discovered what she and my boss had been doing. One day, KARI's phone rang while she was out of the room, so I picked it up. Before I could say anything, I heard a voice on the other end say, "I can't wait to see you." I immediately recognized the voice as my boss's. I was so shocked that I hung up without saying a word. A few minutes later, the phone rang again, and this time KARI answered. I could tell by the look on her face that she was unsettled by the call, but she eventually said, "Okay." That evening, KARI said she wanted to visit a friend. I told her it was fine. We didn't have kids, so it wasn't unusual for either of us to go out. I guess I should properly introduce myself at this point. I'm Michael Adams, an accountant at a large firm. Most people call me Mick. I'm good at what I do, though I can't say my work excites me. My wife, KARI, is a dental hygienist at a local practice. Most people would probably describe her as cute rather than beautiful, but to me, she was the most stunning woman I'd ever met. Of course, I'm biased. I fell head over heels for her the moment I saw her. But after that phone call, I started to doubt if I truly knew my wife. Suddenly, she didn't seem as beautiful as I'd thought. I began questioning if anything in our 3 years of marriage was real. That night, when KARI left, I immediately got into my car and followed her. She drove to a motel. I watched as she walked to a door and knocked. When the door opened, I saw my boss standing there, wrapped in nothing but a towel. He pulled her into the room. She resisted for a moment but eventually went inside. I couldn't understand what my wife saw in him. He was overweight and bald. I waited for about 15 minutes before walking up to the door. I knocked and said in a fake voice, "Receptionist. There might be an issue in your room." A few moments later, Justin opened the door, and I stormed in. I found my wife on the bed, undressed. The look of horror in her eyes when she saw me was unforgettable. "Oh God, Mick!" she cried. "It's not what it looks like." I didn't want to be here, but I had no choice. After that, I launched myself at my boss and beat him severely. Then I turned to my wife, who by then was in shock. "You said you didn't have a choice. Now here's something you do have a choice about, whether to come home or not." "I strongly advise against it," I said as a final warning. With that, I left the room and drove home. Once there, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and drank it quickly. Then I poured another and settled into the armchair in my living room. About 30 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. I knew who it was the police. After confirming my identity, they handcuffed me and took me to the county jail. I've heard about how tough it can be in jail. A reasonable person would have been scared, but I wasn't. I was so angry that I didn't care about anything or anyone. Unfortunately, someone decided to make me their target. I hit him so hard they had to take him to the county hospital. Luckily for me, there was a security camera in the cell, and it clearly showed that the other inmate had started the fight. According to the police, I was just defending myself. That night, I pulled a double shift in terms of fights. The two men I hit ended up in the hospital. As for Justin, one of his intimate parts had to be surgically removed, and the other might never function properly again. I was glad, at least he probably wouldn't be able to torment other women in the future. What's ironic is that I'm not a big or imposing guy. However, when I was young, my father taught me and my brothers how to box. Apart from sparring with my brothers, I'd never been in a real fight before. Despite all the pain I caused my boss, it was nothing compared to the pain I felt. The woman I loved more than anyone in the world had shown me she was nothing more than a lying cheater. KARI tried to call me in the following days, but I ignored her and tried to bury my pain. I never wanted to feel that hurt again. When my brother arrived, I told him what had happened. He quickly negotiated my release on bail and took me to stay at his house with his wife, Susan. They were very kind to me, but I was such an emotional wreck that I was difficult to be around. One night, Susan pulled me aside and said, "Mick, I know you're hurting, but your brother and I are not to blame. If you're going to act like a complete jerk, you might as well go back to your unfaithful wife or rent a hotel room." I apologized and, from that day on, started thinking and acting more rationally. My sister-in-law and brother became my safe haven, and I treated them as such. Tom filed the divorce papers for me and also filed a lawsuit against my employer. A few days later, my ex-boss filed a lawsuit against me for the injuries I had caused him. Tom, being smart, managed to get a stay on that case until the criminal charges against me were resolved. Once I was declared not guilty due to temporary insanity, Tom shifted his focus back to my boss. Justin was smiling at the start of the trial, thinking he would get rich at my expense. However, my ex-boss had no idea how deeply my brother had dug into his past. By the time the criminal case against me ended, Tom had found several former employees who testified that Justin had done the same thing to them. As I mentioned earlier, when the trial ended, the jury awarded me a substantial settlement. Of course, Justin was immediately fired, but that wasn't the worst of it for him. He was arrested. The problem with the case against Justin was that there wasn't much physical evidence. However, 6 women testified against him, sharing their stories. I didn't follow the progress of the case because I was completely absorbed in my divorce proceedings. I do remember reading that he was convicted of something else. I didn't care much, except that he was going to jail. I know KARI was called as a witness and attended every day of Justin's trial. I remember exactly that. Everyone was furious that he only received 7 years, even though it was proven that KARI had been blackmailed. I couldn't get past it. All I could think about was my wife and Justin in bed together. So, I filed for divorce. I tried to see things from KARI's perspective, but I couldn't. If only she had trusted me and told me the truth, I could have confronted Justin. But she didn't, and the fact that she kept going back to him made me think that maybe, deep down, KARI liked what was happening. My final divorce hearing was incredibly traumatic. KARI was there with her lawyer and kept trying to talk to me in private before the hearing, but I refused. I was too hurt to give her any attention. When the judge granted our divorce, KARI became hysterical. In the end, they had to call an ambulance for her. I thought I'd never see her again, but I was wrong. Once I was done with all my trials, I had to move on with my life. When all the lawsuits were resolved, my net worth was nearly $3 million. This was even after paying my brother 30% of everything I was awarded. He didn't agree to take it, but I insisted. Now I was divorced and wealthy. But what should I do now? I couldn't return to my previous job, they weren't exactly happy with me, to put it mildly, and I had no interest in working for them again anyway. At that point, my life was adrift, and I was still suffering. It was Susan who came up with the idea that would change my life, though for a long time, I wasn't sure if that change was for better or worse. She suggested that I take a trip to Europe. She reminded me that I had always wanted to travel and now had the means to do so. Of course, when I had talked about traveling, I had always assumed KARI would accompany me. If I took a trip now, KARI obviously wouldn't be there. I started my journey in Italy. Everyone I spoke to loved this country. I was impressed by the historic sites and the wine was excellent, but overall, I felt a bit disappointed. I then took a train to Germany, where I met a charming Englishwoman named Sarah. She turned out to be an excellent travel companion and a first-rate guide. Sarah was striking, with beautiful blonde hair and soft brown eyes. She was petite but had an impressive figure. However, what I liked most was her boundless enthusiasm for everything. It was a refreshing change after the grim existence I had endured over the past few months. It turned out that Sarah was a teacher at a school called Elgro. She said the name as if I should recognize it, but I had never heard of it. Regardless, I asked her all kinds of questions about the subjects she taught and about her life in general. I was a little surprised to learn that she taught math and science to children aged 8 to 13, and I could see from the sparkle in her eyes that she loved her work. For me, Germany would have been a waste of time if not for Sarah. She had a deep knowledge of World War II. While I've never been particularly interested in the subject, Sarah managed to bring it to life, and visiting the places where the events occurred was fascinating. Before anyone assumes there was a romance between Sarah and me, let me clarify, it was never an option. Early in our conversations, she told me she had just gone through a traumatic breakup with her long-term boyfriend and had no intention of entering another relationship anytime soon. For my part, I assured her that I wasn't looking for a new relationship either. I shared the details of my recent divorce, and I was surprised by the compassion Sarah showed for my ex-wife. Although I wasn't seeking a new partner, I was surprised by the number of women who flirted with me. I wondered if it was because I had developed a rugged look. I had a couple of days stubble on my face and had let my hair grow longer than ever before. This wasn't intentional, I had simply become a bit lazy about grooming since I didn't have to worry about work. However, the attention made me uncomfortable, and I frequently apologized to Sarah for it. I felt embarrassed when women flirted with me right in front of her. Sarah, unaware of the nature of our relationship, just laughed and even teased me about it. To be fair, Sarah also had her share of admirers and felt equally awkward when they pursued her. Of course, I teased her about that too. From Germany, I traveled alone to Sweden and Denmark. Sarah had rented an apartment in Paris for 2 weeks, so she went there. I thoroughly enjoyed both Scandinavian countries I visited. The people were warm and friendly, though the language barrier was a bit challenging without Sarah. She spoke 4 languages besides English, Italian, French, German, and Spanish. Even so, I managed to make myself understood with some effort. I reunited with Sarah at her apartment for the last 3 days of her vacation. Paris is a wonderful city, but I wouldn't give you 2 cents for the people who live there. I know it's unfair to judge everyone based on the few I met, but I felt a kind of deep hostility from Parisians toward Americans. And I found French men unbearable. The attention Sarah received in other countries paled in comparison to the aggressiveness of the French. One even sat at our table during dinner and started speaking to Sarah in French. It didn't end well for him when Sarah threw her glass of wine in his face. He just laughed and started mocking me. However, when I stood up and he realized I towered over him, he finally got the message and left. On my second night in Paris, I took Sarah out to dinner and for a walk along the Seine. It was a beautiful evening, and the moon was nearly full. We stopped to watch several boats pass by. For the first time since my marriage ended, I felt at peace. "Sarah," I said, turning to her, "I want to thank you for everything you've done for me. You've turned what could have been an unpleasant trip into something enjoyable. This was exactly what I needed." I leaned in and kissed her on the cheek. A second later, Sarah took my face in her hands and kissed me on the lips. I must admit, I kissed her back. When we pulled apart, neither of us said anything about the kiss. Instead, Sarah started talking about the history of the city and some of the landmarks we were passing. That night, I went to bed feeling embarrassed, but not unhappy. On our last night in Paris, Sarah prepared a wonderful dinner in her apartment. We sat on her balcony, talking for hours. Eventually, I reminded her that we had to get up early the next morning to catch our flight back to London. On my way to the bathroom, I passed Sarah's room, and her door opened. She was wearing a beautiful white nightgown, and in the light from her room, I could see the silhouette of her stunning figure. She threw herself into my arms and kissed me passionately. "Of course," I responded. Before I realized it, we were on her bed, and I was caressing her. Sarah sighed and slipped off her nightgown. I started running my hand across her stomach, kissing her neck, but suddenly, I stopped and pulled away. "I'm sorry, Sarah," I said in a choked voice. "I can't do this. It's still too soon for me." I could see the disappointment in her eyes, but Sarah slowly got up and embraced me. "I understand. I think I could fall for you," she said. "You're a wonderful woman," I assured her. She kissed me on the cheek, and I went to the bathroom to get ready for bed. While brushing my teeth, I kept asking myself if I had been a complete fool for turning Sarah down. The next day, when we landed in London, Sarah and I said our goodbyes, each taking our own taxi. I thanked her again for being such a wonderful guide, and she kissed me on the cheek. Of course, we exchanged addresses before parting and promised to keep in touch, though I was certain that would never happen. However, I invited her to dinner on the last night of my vacation, and she accepted. I still had 2 weeks left on my itinerary, so I rented a Range Rover and decided to tour the United Kingdom. My plan was to visit several major cities in England, then head to Scotland, where I had heard the countryside was breathtaking. After that, I intended to travel south to Wales. I chose the Range Rover because I was told some of Scotland's roads could be quite steep. At least, that was the plan, but it never happened. I cursed myself as I tried to leave London the next evening. I had been delayed at the bank, trying to ensure I had funds for my trip to Scotland. To make matters worse, I had accidentally packed my phone charger in one of my suitcases and hadn't realized my phone battery was dead. Instead of stopping to search through my luggage, I decided to rely on a paper map, a decision that turned out to be either terrible or fortunate, depending on how you view what happened next. I left the bank just before it closed and studied the map for about 5 minutes before deciding on a route. However, an hour later, I was hopelessly lost. I had made it out of London but had no idea where I was. I stopped to ask for directions, which only made me more confused. Frustrated, I veered off the road I was on and pulled over. I tried to recall the names of the last streets I had passed, thinking I could look them up on the map, but after 20 minutes, I realized none of them were on it. I got out of the car and opened the trunk, cursing as I rummaged through my suitcases, searching for my phone charger. That's when it hit me, I had left it in my hotel room. I felt like a complete idiot. Here I was, in a foreign country, without a phone and no idea where I was. While I tried to decide what to do next, I made another decision. I took out my gun. Yes, I know it's illegal to have firearms in England. In fact, I believe it's illegal to own guns in most European countries. But I'm American, and I wasn't about to travel without protection. I had brought my 9mm Ruger with 2 magazines, each holding 18 rounds. I figured that would be sufficient protection. You're probably wondering how I managed to get my gun past customs. Honestly, It wasn't that difficult. I disassembled the gun and placed the parts in custom-made boxes. If my luggage had gone through an X-ray scanner and someone had looked inside those boxes, the strategically placed metal would have made the parts look entirely different, for example, like a smoking pipe. In any case, I hadn't encountered a single issue throughout my trip. You might be wondering how a disassembled gun could be of any use. Usually, when I traveled through the countryside, I kept all the parts close at hand. I could assemble the gun quickly if I needed it. So far, I hadn't needed it and hoped I never would. But at that moment, in the middle of nowhere and with the sun setting, I felt I needed to be prepared. I assembled the pistol, loaded it, and tucked it into my belt. Then I drove slowly down the rural road, wondering where it might lead. I wandered aimlessly until I saw a large, stately mansion on a hill. Surely someone there could tell me where I was. I drove up the hill and reached the back of the mansion. My heart sank a little when I saw no lights on that side of the building. I turned off the car and made my way to the front door. I was about to round the corner when I heard shouting and 2 gunshots. Quickly looking around the building, I saw 2 men lying face down on the ground. Another man was holding a small child with a hood over his head, who was kicking furiously. 2 more men were yelling at each other, with one pointing at the 2 men on the ground. I heard the man pointing shout, "Go back inside and make sure everyone else is neutralized." As soon as that man disappeared into the house, the man wrestling with the child tried to shove him into a car. I stepped out and yelled, "Drop the gun and raise your hands." The man didn't drop his gun, instead, he turned with incredible speed and fired at me. I returned fire. His shot missed, but mine hit him in the shoulder. Not only did he drop the gun, but he also fell to his knees. The man holding the child released him to see what had happened. At that moment, the child started running. The man chased after him. I held my breath, aimed, and fired at the man. The bullet struck him in the leg, and he fell but only momentarily. He quickly got up and limped off in another direction. Taking advantage of the brief respite, I ran back to my car, started it, and sped away from the back of the building. As I passed the kneeling man, he grabbed his gun. A second later, he was firing at me. I thought I was relatively safe, assuming he was shooting with his left hand. I was wrong. I felt a burning sensation on my left side, and when I touched the area, my hand came away bloody. I had no idea how serious it was, but I couldn't stop now. I accelerated down the road and saw the child running parallel to it. Panicking, I hit the brakes and opened the back door. "Get in, kid!" I shouted. "They'll be after us any second." Fear was etched on the child's face, but I think he decided he was safer with me than without me. As soon as he closed the door, I hit the gas again and sped off, heading, as far as I could tell, toward the main road. "Hey, kid," I asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror, "do you have any idea where we are?" The child seemed stunned and simply shook his head. When we reached the end of the driveway, it was a 50-50 decision, left or right. I chose left. Bad decision. If I had turned right, the road would have led to the main highway, where I could have found help quickly. By turning left, I ended up deeper in the countryside, where there seemed to be no houses. Later, I learned it was an area with vast estates, and some houses were literally miles apart. "We're almost out of gas," I said aloud. The child looked confused, so I repeated it slowly. "Gas. We're almost out of gas." "Oh, I understand," the child replied weakly. "That's terrible. What are we going to do?" I found his British accent charming, kids often are, but at that moment, it was the last thing on my mind. "We're getting off this road," I said, sharply turning left and heading up a hill. Thank God I had a Range Rover, driving off-road was easy. I doubted the Mercedes I'd seen at the driveway entrance could handle it. After checking the built-in compass on the dashboard, I told the child, "I'm heading south. London is at least south of us." I glanced at him in the rearview mirror again. It was clear he was scared, but he was keeping it together, and I gave him credit for that. Most kids in his situation would be hysterical. As we drove, I asked, "What's your name?" The question seemed to frighten him, but he stammered, Hi, George. George. My name's Mick, I said. Now tell me what's going on. Please, sir, what's your full name? The child asked. The question caught me off guard until I realized what he was asking. Oh, my full name is Mick Adams. Thank you for saving me, Mr. Adams, the child said timidly. I haven't saved anyone yet, I replied. I continued asking where we were and why those men were after him. I don't exactly know, George said, his voice trembling. I didn't want to push him too hard, but I appreciated how much self-control and bravery he was showing. I was at my friend Peter's house for the weekend when those people broke in. They put a bag over my head, and one of them dragged me away. I don't know what happened to Peter, his parents, or their staff. It sounds like Peter's parents have money and this is a kidnapping, I said, sharing my opinion. They probably took Peter too. I shared my opinion about the situation. We need to keep moving until we find help, I said. We continued through fields and across streams, but we didn't find any houses or buildings. All I could think about was heading south. Eventually, we had to come across a road. We climbed a hill, descended into a field, and then climbed another hill. As we ascended the second hill, the car started sputtering. I realized we were almost out of gas. I found some bushes to hide the car and stopped. I got out and walked to the trunk. Opening it, I pulled out one of my suitcases and began searching through it. Not finding what I was looking for, I grabbed another suitcase. After about 30 seconds of rummaging, I found a flashlight. George, listen, I said to the boy as I opened the car door. We have to walk. I don't know if those people will figure out we're not in the car anymore, but we have to assume they will and keep moving until we find help. Before leaving, I grabbed 2 sweaters, a wool hat, a large water bottle, and 4 packs of cookies. It was cold outside, and I didn't know how long we'd be on the run before finding help. Besides, I didn't know about the boy, but I was hungry. I decided the best direction was still south, so I looked up at the sky and found the brightest star. I decided we could follow it. We walked for about 3 hours, stopping occasionally to rest and drink water. We crossed several streams, but I didn't dare fill the bottle with stream water. As the hour approached midnight, I could tell the boy was very tired. Despite the difficult journey, he didn't utter a single word of complaint. We spoke little, as I didn't want to give away our location in case someone was nearby. I found a thicket of bushes, gathered 2 piles of leaves to make an improvised bed, and told George to sleep. He didn't argue and, within minutes, was fast asleep. I stayed awake for another hour. The first thing I did was examine the wound on my left side where I'd been shot. It was deep and bleeding, so I tore my shirt and bandaged the wound as best as I could. Then I took one of the sweaters and covered George with it, putting the other one on myself before falling into a restless sleep. The first rays of morning sun woke me. Sitting up, I groaned from the pain in my side. I now regretted not bringing ibuprofen. When I got up, I woke George. How are you feeling? I asked. I hurt all over, sir, he replied. So do I said with a laugh. Here, have some cookies. I tossed him a pack as he sat up and started eating. I studied the boy, he was still scared but surprisingly calm. I passed him the water and gave him another pack of cookies. Then I checked my wound. Thankfully, it seemed to have stopped bleeding. Excuse me, sir, George asked timidly, what's going to happen to us? We're going to find help, and then your parents will pick you up, I replied. After that, I suppose I'll have to see a doctor to get some stitches. You seem very brave, sir, George said. I wish I were that brave. What are you talking about? You've been extremely brave, I assured him. There's no shame in that. It's just. I don't want people to be disappointed in me, George said, looking at me directly. George, I'm going to teach you one of the most important lessons in life, I said with a smile. There's only one person you should never disappoint. George looked confused. Who could that be? He asked. The only person you should never disappoint is yourself, I said firmly. If you do what you believe is right and give your best effort, you won't need to apologize to anyone. And if someone tells you otherwise, tell them to get lost. This made George laugh, and his mood started to lift. Once we gathered our belongings, we resumed our journey. I was in a lot of pain and knew my wound was infected. I simply couldn't keep it clean. Not only that, but we no longer had a guiding star, and I preferred staying behind trees rather than walking openly through fields. The path was much harder than the night before, but we managed to keep going. In the distance, I saw helicopters circling. I hoped they were searching for us and prayed they'd come our way. By noon, we ran out of water, and I had no choice but to fill our bottle from a stream. I could only hope there weren't harmful bacteria in the water. Still, I reasoned they had to find us before either of us got sick. As night began to fall, we still hadn't found a single house. Later, I learned that we had somehow managed to pass within a few hundred meters of at least a dozen houses. If we just veered slightly in either direction, we would have seen them. Once again, I found a dense thicket and prepared our makeshift beds. We settled in, but this time there weren't as many leaves, and it was quite uncomfortable. I also felt like I was burning up and suspected I was developing a fever. The next day, we set out again, but now it was getting harder for me to keep up. There was sympathy, uncertainty, and fear in George's eyes. I knew he still didn't fully trust me, but I just smiled at him and said I was fine. He didn't believe me for a second. As the second day passed into the third, our conversations became much livelier. I was no longer as concerned about being overheard. We talked about many things, his studies, friends, and even a little about his parents. He seemed reluctant to discuss them, so I didn't push. He mentioned that his mother and father were very strict and had high expectations of him. I reminded him again that the only person he needed to please was himself. Towards evening, I started burning up with fever. We reached a point where we couldn't stay in the wooded area and needed to cross an open field to continue. I told George we would walk quickly across the field to the forest on the other side. We were about 100 meters from the edge of the forest when I heard the distinctive sound of a diesel engine. I cursed under my breath, it sounded like a Mercedes. "Run, George!" I ordered and pushed him forward as I followed. I glanced back just in time to see the Mercedes crest the hill and begin descending into the field, heading straight for us. We reached a cluster of fallen trees just as the shooting started. Bullets came from the approaching car. We climbed over the fallen trees, and I positioned myself behind them. "George, listen carefully," I said, gripping his hand tightly. "I want you to keep running. Get as far away as you can. When you hear the shooting stop, find a place to hide and don't come out until they're gone." "But, Mr. Adams, what about you?" George asked, panic in his eyes. "I'll hold them off as long as I can," I replied. "Now, be brave and go, just like I told you." I thought George was going to argue, but I gave him a slight push, and he started running. It was a good thing, too, because the Mercedes was now less than 30 meters from me. They began shooting again, but this time, I fired back. I don't think they expected that. People in Britain don't usually carry guns. In any case, the car swerved and stopped sideways. The men hid behind the car and returned fire. I could see there were 5 of them, and all were armed. I found a spot where I could kneel and fire carefully through the gaps in the trees. As I returned fire cautiously, I hoped George had gotten far enough away. I was halfway through my second magazine when it happened. It felt like the shooting had gone on for hours, but it had only been about 5 minutes. So far, I had been lucky, the trees blocked most of the bullets. But then, one bullet tore through the branches and hit me in the right side. The impact knocked me to the ground. It might have taken me 10 seconds or more to regain my senses. As I lay there, one of the men decided to move closer to check on me. That was a mistake. I fired, and he fell. I shot twice more but then started to lose consciousness. At that moment, I heard a roar and saw a shadow pass overhead. That's when I saw helicopters flying above. Armed men descended on ropes, firing as they came down. Then everything went blank, and I closed my eyes. I woke up to a bright light and incredible pain. A woman was right beside me, and I remember someone saying, "We need to get him back to the operating room." Then darkness consumed me again. When I woke a second time, it felt like I was floating. The room was bright, and I felt no pain. A nurse was next to me, checking my pulse. When she saw my eyes open, she smiled. "Welcome back, Mr. Adams," she said in a charming British accent. "It's so good to see you among the living. You gave us quite a scare last night, we thought we might lose you several times. But the doctor says you're finally out of danger." My throat was painfully dry, but I managed to croak out, "The boy." "That's all you can say?" The nurse replied kindly. "Someone will be here soon to talk to you." She didn't directly answer my question, which filled me with anxiety. Soon, I drifted back to sleep. When I woke again, it was nighttime. After a while, an attendant appeared, gave me some soup, and helped me drink some juice. There were 4 lines all around my bed, connected to me. I didn't know how long I slept afterward, but when I woke again, it was already daytime. A doctor stood by my bed, reviewing my chart. I blurted out my question again. "The boy." "Oh, Mr. Adams, you're awake." "Wonderful," the doctor said, smiling. "The boy is fine. But I was told he was completely heartbroken when they brought him in. He was found holding on to you, begging you to wake up. He was covered in your blood, but he didn't suffer any injuries. Is he a relative?" I shook my head, but even that small effort exhausted me. I drifted back to sleep but must not have been out for long, because when I woke up, it was still daytime. A few minutes later, the nurse entered the room and smiled when she saw I was awake. "How are you feeling, Mr. Adams?" she asked. "My throat hurts a lot," I replied, almost in a whisper. "And my side hurts too." "I'll bring you something for the pain," she said, then added, "There are people who want to speak with you. Do you feel strong enough to talk?" I nodded. A man who looked to be in his 40s entered the room and sat in the chair next to my bed. He had gray hair and a thick mustache. "Mr. Adams, I'm Inspector Blair from Scotland Yard. I'd like to get an informal statement from you if that's all right." "Of course," I replied, surprised to hear that my voice sounded a bit stronger. "You've obviously had a difficult experience," the inspector began. "The doctors told me you had trouble breathing for some time, and they're still a bit concerned about your infection. But fortunately, it seems you're on the road to recovery. Could you tell me about your involvement in the incident last Monday?" I slowly shook my head, trying to organize my thoughts. "I'm afraid I can't tell you much," I admitted. "I really had no idea what was happening. I think I stumbled into a kidnapping. Before I knew it, George and I were running away. We spent several days trying to find help, but we never came across anyone. Then the kidnappers caught up to us. I tried to hold them off long enough for George to escape." The inspector smiled as though he knew much more about the incident than I did, understandable, since I knew practically nothing. "Tell me, Mr. Adams, how did you end up at the house where the kidnapping occurred?" "I got lost," I admitted, embarrassed. "I didn't charge my phone before leaving London and tried to use a paper map, but all I managed to do was get completely lost. I found a dirt road that led to the back of a mansion. I was hoping to ask someone there for directions. But when I turned the corner, I saw they were trying to kidnap George. I had a gun with me and used it to free the boy. We escaped in my rental car, but it was almost out of gas. When the car stopped, George and I had to walk. After that, we didn't find anyone to help us. I just tried to hold them off. How did we find you? The inspector asked, leaning forward. Since the kidnapping was reported, search teams and helicopters have been scouring the area. One of the helicopter pilots spotted the car descending the hill and followed it. They encountered your gunfight and stopped it. Then you and the boy were taken to the hospital. At first, we thought the boy was seriously injured because he was covered in blood, but it turned out to be your blood. He refused to leave your side. I told you he was brave, I said. The inspector leaned back in his chair and smiled. This is an incredible story. It's true, I swear, I protested. If you don't believe me, ask George. Oh, I believe you, Mr. Adams, the inspector replied. However, there's one point I'd like to clarify, the gun you used to defend yourself. Where did it come from? I felt like a deer caught in headlights. The phrase "uh-oh" ran through my mind. I knew I was in trouble. But I also knew that without the gun, I'd probably be dead. I brought it with me from the United States, I said quietly. I don't think so, Mr. Adams, the inspector replied with a smirk. It's illegal to bring firearms into the UK. The gun we found had its serial numbers filed off. So, receiving it from the kidnappers is the only plausible explanation. Wouldn't you agree? The confusion I had felt suddenly gave way to crystal clear understanding. The inspector was giving me a way out, a plausible explanation for the gun's presence. I wasn't about to waste the opportunity. Yes, that's exactly what happened, I confirmed quickly. I managed to surprise one of the kidnappers and take his gun. Excellent, Inspector Blair said, standing up. You know, I could use a cup of tea. May I suggest that you have one too? To be honest, Inspector, I'd kill for a cup of coffee, I replied. He laughed. I'll see what I can do. 10 minutes later, the inspector returned with an attendant who brought a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, and a plate of what I assumed the British call biscuits, cookies. Mr. Adams, the inspector began after taking a sip of tea, there's a lot to tell you and much to resolve before you speak to anyone else. So, let me start by correcting a misunderstanding. The boy you know as George is actually Peter. Peter is the future Duke of Windsor, or as you might call him, the future King of England. However, the proper title is the future King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. This revelation left me utterly stunned. I couldn't think of anything to say, so I remained silent. His Highness was spending the weekend with his friend George at the estate of Lord and Lady Ashford. Lord and Lady Ashford are George's parents. There was a security team of 8 guards on site. 2 of these guards were killed, 3 were severely injured, and the rest were incapacitated. This was a well-planned and coordinated attempt against the prince. In fact, if you hadn't stumbled upon them, they would have succeeded in capturing him, and we wouldn't have known what happened. We don't yet know why these individuals tried to kidnap the prince, nor how they knew where he was. These are matters we will undoubtedly investigate. For now, the only thing I know for certain is that you are a true hero. I considered the inspector's words and then responded weakly, I don't feel like a hero. Honestly, I feel a little dizzy. Should I call someone? The inspector asked. I shook my head. No, I'll be fine. We just need to decide what to do next. The inspector finished his tea, took out a notepad and pen, and said, the information about the attempted kidnapping of the prince leaked almost immediately. Since then, the nation has been in shock. Now that the prince has been successfully rescued, celebrations have been taking place for several days, both here and abroad. However, this has also put intense pressure on practically every investigative agency in the UK to get to the bottom of what happened. Suddenly, I felt a wave of panic. The entire incident felt like an attack, and if that were the case, my family and I could be in danger. "May I make a request?" I asked. "Of course, you can make a request," the inspector said, "but whether I can fulfill it is an entirely different matter." "Could you avoid mentioning my name?" I asked immediately. "Interesting," the inspector said, smoothing his mustache. "Why do you want me to do that?" "I just think it would be safer," I tried to explain. "If I'm on their list of those who thwarted their plans, they might try to take revenge on my family and me." "Yes, I understand the potential problem," the inspector agreed. "I'll speak with my superiors about it and let you know in a few days. For now, we'll keep it confidential. Are there people who might worry if they don't hear from you? If so, we can contact them and explain it as a COVID-related issue," he added. "Maybe my parents," I said after thinking for a moment. "What day is it today?" "Today is Friday, the 6th. I've lost nearly a week," I said quietly. "I have a flight back to the United States a week from this Sunday." "I doubt you'll be out of the hospital in a week," the inspector said. "It might be better if we send an email to your parents from your account, saying that you're extending your vacation. We've located your itinerary and luggage and have been tracking the places where you plan to stay to see if anyone tried to contact you. So far, no one has," he added. "There's one other person I should mention," I said, remembering my obligation. "I was supposed to have dinner with Miss Sarah Smith on Saturday night." The inspector raised his eyebrows. "How do you know Miss Smith?" "I met her on the train to Germany," I explained. "We became friends, and she also acted as my unofficial guide. There's nothing romantic between us, she was just very kind and helpful." "I see," the inspector said, standing up. "We'll send her an email informing her that you were in an accident, you're not seriously injured, but you'd prefer to be treated at home by your doctor. In the meantime, police officers will remain outside your room 24/7 until we decide how to proceed. I'll contact you in a few days once we have a clearer picture of things. For now, I hope you understand that we'll need to keep you isolated. Will that be a problem?" I shook my head. The following days were challenging. As I began to recover, they reduced my pain medication, which meant there were moments when I felt considerable discomfort, especially after physical therapy. At first, I wasn't doing well. It was interesting to watch the news reports. The atmosphere, especially in Britain, was one of grateful celebration, but there was also anger directed at the police for failing to prevent the kidnapping. After watching a day or two of continuous coverage, it became difficult to keep following it. I think I was experiencing a mild form of post-traumatic stress disorder. Just when I began to think Inspector Blair had forgotten about me, he arrived the following Tuesday. I was hopeful he would have good news, like when I might be discharged. I just wanted to heal and go home. I was standing by the window, wishing I could be outside, when the inspector entered my room. "You're looking remarkably well, Mr. Adams. I'm so glad to see you recovering so quickly," he said warmly. "This makes my news even more pleasant." "That sounds promising," I replied, sitting on the edge of my bed. "We've made incredible efforts to get to the bottom of this cowardly attack. Unfortunately, we still don't know who was behind the kidnapping. However, we managed to capture 2 of the criminals alive, and we remain hopeful that at least one of them will tell us what we need to know." "Well, that makes my request just as relevant as before," I replied. "I hope you'll keep my name a secret. You're an interesting man, Mr. Adams. Most men would enjoy the glory of being called a hero, but you want to remain anonymous. Your first concern is your family, which is very commendable. But to put your mind at ease, my superiors agree that your identity should remain confidential. We'll do everything possible to ensure your name isn't made public. However, I must admit that initially, some of my superiors were in favor of releasing your name immediately. A few in the department even suspected you might have been part of a conspiracy. They didn't believe your story about accidentally witnessing the kidnapping. Some thought you were involved but backed out at the last moment. But after tracking your rental car, we confirmed everything you told us. Additionally, the prince himself was adamant that you had no involvement in the kidnapping. That's wonderful, I said with a smile. Does this mean I'll be able to return to the United States as soon as I'm discharged from the hospital? I can't wait to get home. Yes, you'll be allowed to leave the country as soon as you're discharged, the inspector confirmed. We believe the sooner you go, the safer you'll be. Have my parents tried to contact me? I asked. Yes, they attempted to call and sent you an email, the inspector said. Obviously, we couldn't return the call, but we replied to their email, saying you had limited cell coverage. I spoke with the doctors, and they'll discharge you on Saturday. We've taken the liberty of booking you a flight that afternoon. That day, you'll leave the hospital accompanied by a security officer. On Friday, the day before I was discharged, the inspector returned and handed me my phone. You're free to call anyone you'd like, he said. I called my parents and told them I'd been in an accident. I lied, saying it wasn't serious but had required a hospital visit. My mother was very distressed and wanted to fly over to help me return home. I lied again, claiming I had taken a bad fall off a bike but was doing fine. I assured her I'd be home before she had time to book a ticket. This seemed to calm her. On Saturday morning, after breakfast, I got up and dressed. I couldn't wait to leave the hospital and return home. Around 11 a.m., I heard a noise in the hallway near my room. I looked out and saw a well-dressed couple and a boy walking toward my room. It took me a moment, but then I recognized George, or rather, Peter. As the couple approached, the men and women in the hallway either bowed or curtsied. It was surreal to witness. You read about how British royalty is treated, but you never expect to see it in person. The couple was gracious to everyone they passed, but Peter looked worried. When he finally saw me, he quickened his pace and reached me before his parents. Your Highness, I greeted him with a smile. Mr. Adams, it's such a pleasure to see you in good health, Peter said with a wide smile. When they lifted you into the helicopter, I was so afraid you had been killed. Thank you so much for helping me. By then, the king and queen were close behind their son. Your Majesties, I said with a slight bow, it's a great honor to meet you. No, Mr. Adams, the honor is ours, the king replied, extending his hand. We shook hands, and I couldn't believe I was shaking hands with the king. And, of course, I could never tell anyone about it. I thought to myself, it's better this way. Mr. Adams, the queen continued, I'll never be able to thank you enough for saving our son. I had such a hard time after this incident. I shudder to think of what could have happened if you hadn't been there. You'll always be in our thoughts and prayers. Then the queen extended her hand, and as I shook it, she glanced around quickly before lifting my hand and kissing it. I was completely stunned and had no idea how to react. You can be very proud of your son, I finally managed to say. He was incredibly brave under difficult circumstances. Without his help, I don't think we'd be standing here today. The meeting ended, and they departed. The royal family had been advised not to make too much fuss over me, as it could raise suspicions among the public. Later, I learned that this visit was supposedly off their official agenda. However, they had insisted on visiting the hospital to thank me personally. I was deeply moved by this gesture. All the time I spent in the hospital gave me a lot of time to reflect on my life, and I wasn't particularly happy with myself. The flight home had me thinking about what I would do next. My parents were there to meet me, and I could see the relief in my mother's eyes as her worries about my health faded. She hugged me tightly. My father, too, was happy to see me home and gave me a hug. It hurt a little, and I explained that my wounds were still a bit tender. Still, I was glad for the embrace, it was something my dad rarely did. He always told people he wasn't much of a hugger, though that wasn't entirely true. He took every opportunity to hug my mom. While we stood by the baggage claim, my mom grew quiet and serious. "Mick, I did something that might make you very angry with me," she said. "But please, if you're going to be mad at me." "I can't think of anything you've done that would make me angry, Mom," I replied. "You might change your mind very soon," she said, glancing toward one of the exit doors. I followed her gaze and saw KARI standing there, looking nervous. Her red eyes told me she'd been crying. KARI looked pale and was trembling slightly. A few weeks ago, I would have been furious with my mom and walked away. But when you've been as close to death as I have, you gain a completely different perspective on life. Suddenly, many things you thought were important no longer are. When I looked at KARI, I no longer saw the unfaithful wife. I saw a woman who was alone, sad, and scared. I also saw a woman who had been taken advantage of and one who still seemed to love me. She was still the beautiful woman I had fallen in love with. I smiled at her and walked toward where she stood. "Hi, KARI," I said softly. "Thank you for coming to welcome me home." With those words, KARI's composure collapsed. She threw herself into my arms, crying on my shoulder and repeating over and over, "I'm so sorry. Please forgive me." I calmed her and then led her to where my parents were waiting with my luggage. "I didn't like the food on the plane, so I barely ate anything," I said cheerfully. "How about I invite all of you to dinner? I'm starving." I can't say things between KARI and me improved overnight, but it was a start. At first, I wasn't sure what I wanted. All I knew was that I no longer wanted to punish KARI, I wanted her to be happy. A few days later, I invited her to lunch to talk about our issues. We started seeing a psychologist and eventually began dating again. Through our sessions, I learned that KARI had accepted the infidelity out of fear of disappointing me. I also discovered that I had reinforced this belief by overly praising her when she met my expectations and unintentionally showing disappointment when she didn't. I had never realized I was doing this, but looking back, I could see it was true. It took us months to work through our problems, but I never stopped loving KARI. So, with a small group of family members, KARI and I remarried in the garden of her parents' house. Of all the people involved in our second wedding, besides ourselves, I think our mothers were the happiest. For our honeymoon, I took KARI on a cruise. This time, KARI and I didn't have any physical intimacy before getting married again. Neither of us wanted to cloud our emotions. So, on our first night in the cabin, we were both nervous. I know it sounds funny, given that we'd made love hundreds of times during our first marriage, but this second marriage felt very different. For me, KARI was still the most beautiful woman I had ever known. Her long brown hair and delicate features captivated me as much as ever. When we got into bed, I felt her trembling with anticipation. She smelled wonderful, and her touch was even better. We sat together for a while as I kissed her and gently breathed on her neck. When she turned toward me, we kissed passionately, our tongues exploring each other. I lifted her nightgown and removed my shirt, then began kissing one of her breasts. We spent the rest of the night making love. The rest of the honeymoon was much like that first night. Of course, we went on excursions, danced, and attended shows. But mostly, we made love. I had fallen in love with my wife all over again. Yet, deep down, there was still a lingering doubt about trust. It became evident only years later, but I think it started that first night. 2 months after the wedding, KARI discovered she was pregnant. 7 months later, we had a son we named Grant. 11 months after that, we had a daughter we named Lise. 3 years later, KARI returned to work part-time. At first, I was happy for her new job, but I couldn't help myself. Each month, my suspicions and jealousy grew. I kept my fears to myself, but that created tension in our marriage. Although KARI did nothing to cause concern, I worried anyway. At the same time, without realizing it, I began to distance myself from my wife. I suppose I was mentally preparing myself because I couldn't shake the feeling that KARI would betray me again. KARI suffered because of my mood, and it affected her deeply. We started arguing more and more. Eventually, I began considering divorce. It was KARI who convinced me to see a psychologist again. At first, the sessions seemed to achieve nothing at all. But gradually, I came to see the hole I had dug for myself. Once I understood my own issues, our relationship improved significantly. We spent the next year rebuilding our relationship, and life was wonderful for my family and me. Then tragedy struck. Unbeknownst to us, Justin Bosner had been released from prison early. His hatred for me had grown exponentially during his time behind bars. One night, after we had just put the kids to bed, we heard the sound of several windows shattering at the front of our house. I went to see what was happening while KARI went to check on the children. When I entered the living room, I found Justin standing there, pointing a gun at me. "Well, Mickey, I've been waiting for this moment for a long time," he growled. "I'm going to destroy you, and then your pretty wife. I'm sure she'll enjoy it as much as the first time." I wanted to tear his head off and took a step forward, but he aimed the gun more directly at me. "I wouldn't do that, Mick. I could end you before you even get close, but I want to savor this moment a little longer." At that moment, I saw KARI run from the dining room into the living room and grab the gun. As Justin tried to wrestle it back, I moved quickly to help. In the struggle, the gun went off. Before I could take control of it, KARI fell to the ground. She punched Justin in the jaw, causing him to stumble backward and hit his head against the wall, knocking him unconscious. I found myself kneeling, holding KARI in my arms. She had been shot in the stomach. I grabbed the phone from the coffee table and called 911. It felt like hours, but the police and an ambulance arrived 8 minutes later. I pressed a towel against her wound and kept shouting, "Please hold on, KARI. Please don't die." KARI lay in my arms, looking at me. "You're the only one I've ever loved. Thank you for taking me back. Take care of our children," she said before closing her eyes. She never opened them again. The hospital staff did everything they could to save her, but the damage was too severe. I was utterly devastated. Thank God for our two mothers, they moved in with me and took care of everything while I was a shell of myself. It took me a long time to realize that KARI had always been my one true love. I know I attended the funeral, but I don't remember anything about it. All I recall is thinking that I should be dead, not KARI. Justin was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, but he committed suicide in prison before his trial. I was furious that he had escaped justice so easily. It took about 3 months, but I finally began to emerge from my stupor. My children were the main reason for my recovery. I had to be strong for them. They missed their mother as much as I did, but as children, they bounced back more quickly. I didn't know if I would ever fully heal, but they relied on me. For KARI's sake, I couldn't fail them. I was still traumatized, and no matter how hard I tried to hide it, my mother could tell. She was the one who suggested I travel with the kids. At first, I was hesitant, but I eventually agreed. We decided to go to the United Kingdom. My parents and KARI's parents agreed to come along to help with the children. By then, I no longer felt any anxiety about returning to England. About 1.5 years after the incident, Scotland Yard uncovered a plot to kidnap the Crown Prince. It turned out that the plot was orchestrated by a small group of opponents to the royal family. There were about 30 people in the group, 2 of whom worked at Buckingham Palace and had access to the royal schedule. Most of the participants had no idea what their leaders were planning, but all received varying prison sentences. The ultimate plan was to assassinate the Crown Prince. I had wisely invested the funds I received during the divorce, and they had now grown to almost $5 million. So, I decided to indulge on this trip, booking first-class tickets for everyone and reserving rooms at the Langham, one of the best hotels in London. I assumed the records of the incident would remain sealed forever. However, they were only sealed for 5 years, and unless the case remained unresolved, the sealing period would not be extended. Another year passed before someone requested the records be made public, and eventually, that request was granted. At the time, I had asked for my name not to be mentioned in any reports. But that didn't happen, my name was everywhere. When we returned to the UK, persistent reporters tracked my movements and calculated the date of my arrival. If I'd had even the slightest idea of what was about to happen, I never would have taken this trip. I would have moved my entire family to a secluded place known only to me and stayed there until everything calmed down. But I had no idea. So, I embarked on a journey I hoped would help heal my soul from the loss of KARI and the guilt I felt for not fully trusting her love. As I packed for the trip, I came across Sarah Smith's phone number, which I had forgotten about long ago. I assumed the number was no longer in service or had been reassigned. But on a whim, I called, wondering if there was a chance it was still hers. Perhaps I could convince her to join us on our travels. After all, I still owed her a dinner from when I abruptly fled England over 6 years ago. To my pleasant surprise, the number still belonged to Sarah. Even more delightful was that she immediately remembered who I was. Sarah said she had been very disappointed when I had to cancel our dinner but assured me she completely understood why. I felt a little guilty for not being able to tell her the real reason, but that chapter of my life felt best left in the past. We ended up talking for over 2 hours. I could only imagine what my phone bill would be. Still, it was a lovely conversation. I have several friends with whom I can go months without speaking, yet when we reconnect, it feels like no time has passed. That's how it was with Sarah. We gradually caught each other up on our lives over the past 5 years. Sarah was happy to hear I had remarried KARI and that we had 2 children. She told me she was still teaching at the same school but had been promoted to assistant principal. However, she had a brief and disastrous marriage 2 years ago, ending in a particularly acrimonious divorce that left her ex-husband bitter. It was clear that the failed marriage still affected her. Eventually, I shared the story of KARI's murder and my attempts to rebuild my life. There was a long silence after I finished, and for a moment, I thought Sarah might have hung up. Then I heard her take a deep breath on the other end of the line. "Oh, Michael, that makes me feel so miserable," she said in a trembling voice. She always called me by my full name, rarely using my nickname. "But you have your children. I know it may seem like little comfort now, but in the years to come, you'll realize just how truly blessed you are." At first, I didn't know what to say. Then I let out a hesitant laugh and suggested we move past the sad stories. Sarah agreed and started sharing some funny anecdotes about her students. I appreciated the humor, but eventually, I revealed the real purpose of my call. "Look, no, I'm saying this at the last minute, but I'm going to England with the kids and their grandparents," I explained. "I'd love to do some traveling, and if there's any way you could join us, I'd be thrilled." "Oh, Michael, I'd love to do that," Sarah replied, "but I can't get away right now. It's mid-semester, and I have too many classes to teach." "I'm so sorry." "I understand," I said, unable to hide my disappointment. "Look, I still owe you that dinner from last time. Maybe you could set aside one evening to have dinner with me." "I'd love that," Sarah said immediately. "But you have to promise to bring your kids and their grandparents." "I'd love to meet them all." "Wonderful," I said cheerfully. "I'll call you when I get to London, and we'll arrange something." As I said, even as we flew across the Atlantic, the secrets I had hoped would remain locked away forever were about to come to light. We arrived early in the morning, and I knew the best way to beat jet lag was to stay awake until it was bedtime in the new time zone. If you did this, you'd be adjusted by the next day. The kids had slept for most of the flight, so they were eager to start enjoying the trip. My parents and KARI's parents weren't thrilled with the plan, but they agreed because I insisted. As soon as we checked into our rooms, I called Sarah and arranged to have dinner with her the following evening. Then we set off to explore London. We visited the Tower of London, took a boat trip on the Thames, and went to Legoland Windsor. We all had a great time. But the next morning, everything was about to change. That night, I went to bed happier than I had been in a long time. I was excited about our excursion and dinner with Sarah. The next morning, I woke up to a knock on my hotel room door. I had booked a 2-bedroom suite for myself and the kids, and they were still asleep in one of the rooms. Hastily, I pulled on my pants and shirt and stumbled to the door. I opened it to find a respectable-looking middle-aged man standing in the doorway with a newspaper under his arm. "Apologies for the intrusion, Mr. Adams," the man said politely. "My name is James Butterman, and I'm the manager of this hotel. I deeply regret disturbing your rest, but I urgently need to speak with you." Still half asleep, I gestured for him to come in. Behind him, a waiter pushed a cart laden with juice, tea, coffee, and covered dishes. Mr. Butterman directed the waiter to set everything on a table in the corner. Once done, the waiter was dismissed. Mr. Butterman immediately poured me a cup of coffee, which I accepted gratefully. "I think you should sit down, Mr. Adams," he said. "There's some news I'm fairly certain you're unaware of." As soon as I sat down, Mr. Butterman unfolded the newspaper in front of me. The headline read, "Mystery of Prince Peter's Kidnapping Solved." Below the title was a large, color photograph of me. Quickly, I skimmed the article, my thoughts racing in 1,000 directions. But one thing dominated my mind: protecting my children. After reading enough of the article to realize I had been fully exposed, I looked at Mr. Butterman. "How bad is it?" I asked. "At the moment, hundreds of people and dozens of media outlets are crowding outside the hotel, hoping to see you. Apparently, rumors have spread that you're in London and staying here. Television stations have been talking about you all morning. I expect the crowd outside the hotel will grow. I've already contacted the police to request crowd control measures. In short, Mr. Adams, you've become a media sensation. All of the UK wants to know everything about you." My mind was a whirlwind, and I still didn't know what to do. But then it suddenly dawned on me why Mr. Butterman was visiting me. "I suppose you want us to leave and stay somewhere else, right?" I asked. "Oh, goodness no!" Mr. Butterman exclaimed, looking horrified. "I'm only here to inform you of what's happening and to assure you that we'll do everything possible to protect your privacy." "What do you propose we do?" I asked, still unsure how to handle this overwhelming situation. Frankly, I was a little scared. "Personally, I'd advise you and your family to remain at the hotel, at least for today," Mr. Butterman suggested. "Hopefully, things will calm down, and people will lose interest. In the meantime, I'll contact our headquarters to see what they recommend." "The only issue with your plan," I said, "is that I have a dinner planned with a friend at the Palace restaurant." Mr. Butterman thought for a moment and then offered a solution. "May I suggest inviting your friend to dine here? Our hotel has a 4-star restaurant with only 46 seats, so it will be quiet and private." I told Mr. Butterman that his suggestion was excellent and that I'd cancel my reservation to make a new one. "Please, allow me to handle that for you," he offered, and I accepted. I was still in shock over what was happening and hadn't even thought to look outside. "Mr. Butterman, may I ask you something? I'm hoping you can help me make sense of all this." "Of course. I'll answer anything I can," he replied. "Why is this so important now?" I asked. "The kidnapping happened over 6 years ago. Sure, maybe the police were confused about some details, but does it really matter? The prince was rescued, and he's safe and sound." Mr. Butterman paused for a moment, then smiled kindly. "Mr. Adams, you're American, so our royal family may be more of a curiosity for your people than anything else. But for someone truly British, the monarchy is the foundation of our country." The nation was paralyzed with fear and sorrow when it was revealed that the crown prince had been kidnapped. Then, when he was rescued, the entire nation rejoiced as one. If you recall, the news of his safe return marked the beginning of 3 days of celebrations. Now, knowing that you, sir, saved the prince and sought no recognition for your actions, you've captured the imagination and gratitude of this nation. I can tell you that every member of my staff considers it an honor to serve you in any way we can. Also, I want you to know that you won't be paying for anything during your stay here at the Langham. I can't accept that, Mr. Butterman, I protested immediately. Our presence here is already causing so much inconvenience for you and your staff. Mr. Butterman raised his hands. If it helps your sense of justice, I've spoken with our head office this morning, and they are thrilled with the free publicity. Reservations have already increased by more than 18%. After Mr. Butterman left, Grant and Lise came out of their room. The breakfast he'd left included bacon, eggs, bagels, Danish pastries, and oatmeal. I prepared plates for both of them and seated them in front of the TV, putting on Toy Story, their favorite movie. Then, it was time to make some calls. The first thing I did was call a family meeting. I woke up both sets of grandparents and asked them to come to my room as soon as possible. Then I called Sarah to inform her of the change in plans. When she answered, she picked up on the first ring. "Michael, I can't believe what I'm seeing on the news. Is this all true?" she asked. "Unfortunately, it's all true," I confirmed. "I'm sorry I wasn't honest with you about this, but the truth is, I wanted to leave all of that behind." "So that's why you cancelled our dinner all those years ago?" Sarah asked, her tone a mix of question and statement. "Yes. I'm sorry for misleading you," I apologized. "But the British government agreed it would be best for me to leave the country quickly and quietly. Is it true what they're saying about your injuries? That you nearly died?" "Unfortunately, none of that is an exaggeration," I admitted. "But it's nothing special." I wanted to change the topic and bring the focus back to our dinner that night. "Michael, this is very important," Sarah protested. I could hear the frustration in her voice, though it wasn't directed at me. "You had to endure such a terrible experience alone, and then you came home only to witness your wife being murdered." Her voice broke, and she began to cry. "Please, Sarah, don't cry. I'm okay now. I was only calling to see if you'd still like to have dinner at the hotel tonight. Given the circumstances, I'll understand if you don't want to come. The media has turned this into madness." "I'll be there tonight without fail," Sarah said firmly. "I'm not letting you cancel another dinner with me. I'll see you at 6. When the grandparents arrived, I handed them the newspaper and turned on the television. Every news station was covering me. I was overwhelmed with worry. Looking out the front window of the hotel, I saw hundreds of people milling around. Police had set up barricades to control the crowds. The entire scene felt surreal. As my mother read the paper, she suddenly broke down crying. The day was getting worse by the minute. "What's wrong, Mom?" I asked, alarmed. "You nearly died, and you never told us," she sobbed. "I'm sorry, but I thought it was best to keep it a secret. If those behind the kidnapping had found out, I didn't want them to target anyone else in the family. Later, when it turned out they weren't connected to anything sinister, I didn't see the need to talk about it." I wasn't sure if my explanation satisfied her, but she accepted it. That evening, we gathered in my room before heading to dinner. Sarah looked stunning, and my parents were immediately taken with her. She easily charmed them, soon having them laughing with stories from her role as assistant principal. Dinner started awkwardly when the entire restaurant stood and applauded as we entered. People began approaching our table, introducing themselves and thanking me. I simply smiled and introduced them to my family and Sarah. As more people came over, Grant finally turned to me and asked, "Dad, are you famous?" "Probably," I replied. "But I don't want to be." During dinner, Sarah shared the first good news of the day. After explaining who I was, her school board approved 2 weeks of paid leave for her. Sarah could now travel with us and be our guide. The only question was whether we could still make the trip amid all the chaos. Halfway through dinner, Mr. Butterman approached our table. "My sincerest apologies for interrupting, but may I have a word with you, Mr. Adams?" I excused myself and followed the hotel manager to a quiet spot near the kitchen doors. There, he glanced around to ensure no one was within earshot. "Mr. Adams," he began, "I've contacted our head office, and I was concerned they might ask us to request your departure. Instead, they've come up with a promising idea. They believe it might help calm the media frenzy if you hold an impromptu press conference tomorrow. We could host it in our ballroom. Of course, the decision is entirely up to you." I turned the idea over in my head several times and found myself liking it. "I think it's a great idea. What do I need to do to organize this?" Mr. Butterman smiled and shook his head. "Absolutely nothing. We'll take care of everything. I propose we hold it at 10 a.m. tomorrow. All you need to do is show up in whatever you'd like to wear. Perhaps you could prepare a brief statement, and then we'll allow the press 30 minutes for questions." When I told my parents and Kari's parents about the press conference, they were very impressed. My kids, however, couldn't care less. They were more excited about the cake and ice cream they were promised for the next day. I must admit, I was terrified. I had never done anything remotely like this before, and I'd never been fond of public speaking. At 9:50 a.m., Mr. Butterman escorted me to the main ballroom, and I was stunned by its transformation. The back wall was decorated with American and British flags, and red, white, and blue garlands hung throughout the room. The hotel orchestra was set up to the right of the podium, with crossed US and British flags displayed prominently at the front. As we walked down the central aisle toward the podium, I noticed hundreds of people gathered, with television cameras mounted at the back of the room. My legs felt like jelly as I made my way forward. Suddenly, the crowd began to stand and applaud. By the time I reached the front row, the sound was deafening. My family followed behind me and were seated in the front rows. My children's eyes were wide, taking in the room with total amazement. Both my mother and mother-in-law had tears streaming down their faces as they sat down. Meanwhile, my kids bounced excitedly in their seats, peppering their grandparents with questions. As I stepped onto the hastily built platform, the band began playing the U.S. national anthem, immediately followed by God Save the King. Then, Mr. Butterman approached the microphone, thanked everyone for coming, and handed the stage over to me. I gave a brief speech, letting everyone know I was grateful for their interest but didn't feel deserving of so much attention. Then the questions began. They wanted to know everything that had happened. One of the first questions was how I knew where the prince was in order to save him. I admitted that I hadn't even known he was a prince until I was in the hospital. I explained how I was completely lost and had only hoped to find someone kind enough to give me directions. This drew laughter from the journalists. They especially wanted details about the firefight. I didn't go into much detail but spent most of the time expressing gratitude to the military personnel who had saved us. As I mentioned, if they hadn't arrived when they did, I'd be dead, and possibly the prince, too. After Mr. Butterman thanked everyone for coming, reporters were still shouting questions as I exited. I tried to answer what I could, but thankfully, I quickly made my way back to my room. My children surrounded me, chattering excitedly about all the people who had come to see me. The grandparents were over the moon. Of course, when I had planned this trip, none of us expected anything like this. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, Sarah stood there, smiling at me. I hugged her and thanked her for coming. She laughed. As they say in America, not even wild horses could have stopped me. Michael, you were amazing. I was sitting in one of the back rows, and I've never heard the press speak so enthusiastically about someone. Usually, they're a pretty cynical bunch, always waiting for the next scandal. But they loved how you gave credit to others. They especially liked what you said about your deep respect and admiration for the prince and how brave he was. Like I said, you were fantastic. The next day, we were all invited to Buckingham Palace, even Sarah, which surprised me. During this visit, I learned two very important things about her. First, she was a close friend of the Queen, they had attended school together. Second, I discovered her real name was Lady Sarah Smith. Her father was a duke. At some point, I disconnected from the conversation as Sarah began explaining her family history. It was all too complicated. Finally, the following day, we began our tour. To ensure our safety, the government provided us with a car and 2 security agents. Security was deemed essential for our travels. I initially thought it was unnecessary for the guards to accompany us, but Sarah insisted on having protection, so I didn't make a fuss. Our first stop was Manchester. I've always been a huge soccer fan, having played on both my high school and college teams. Manchester United has always been my favorite professional team, and I hoped we could take a quick look at the stadium before exploring the city. The club went above and beyond my expectations. When they heard I wanted to see the stadium, they arranged a small reception for us. My family, Sarah, and I were given a tour of the field, and I even got to meet some of the players. I was amazed at how kind and welcoming they were. Our next stop was Liverpool, and thankfully, it was a quiet visit. Since our itinerary hadn't been made public, and the royal family had requested that the press respect our privacy, we were able to blend in with the crowds and enjoy our time there. From Liverpool, we traveled north, stopping at places Sarah thought we might enjoy. As a teacher, Sarah had an incredible wealth of knowledge, making each stop much more meaningful. It was so much more fun having someone who could explain the history and importance of each place. We reached Glasgow and then Edinburgh, where we decided to set up our base. From there, we took day trips to nearby attractions. Once again, we were able to move around freely. The initial media frenzy had died down, and I was happy to become yesterday's news. I can't understand why anyone would willingly choose to become a celebrity. During this trip, I realized not only was Sarah an excellent guide, but I was also completely captivated by her. My parents and even KARI's parents grew fond of her quickly, and the kids adored her. What had started as a casual acquaintance had turned into a close friendship. One evening, while Sarah and I were walking together, I realized my feelings for her ran much deeper. We stopped to admire Edinburgh Castle, and suddenly, driven by impulse, I leaned in and kissed her softly on the lips. She looked at me in surprise for a moment, then hugged me and kissed me passionately. We returned to her room, but I wasn't sure what to do next. Luckily, Sarah had her own ideas. We slid into her bed, and as we looked into each other's eyes, she said, "Please don't hurt me." "I'll be very gentle," I assured her. "I like you, Michael, but I've fallen desperately in love with you. Even so, I'll be with you tonight, but if you're not serious, please tell me. It would hurt, but it would destroy me if you left me later." "Sarah," I said softly, "when KARI died, I thought I could never love another woman. But you've shown me I was wrong. I can't promise how this will all end, but I love you. I feel so comfortable and at peace when I'm with you." That was all Sarah needed to hear. After that, she became like a wild woman, unable to get enough of me. At first, being together was all about passion, but later it became slow and tender. By 2 a.m., we had fallen asleep in each other's arms. The next morning at breakfast, it became clear we hadn't been as discreet as we thought. Everyone around us gave Sarah and me knowing smiles. The trip ended far too quickly, and we returned to London. I arranged for my mother to watch the kids, giving Sarah and me the chance to spend one last evening together. The day we left was filled with hugs, kisses, and tears. I could tell Sarah was terrified that as soon as I returned home, I might forget about her. In the following months, Sarah and I spoke every day, sometimes several times a day. The kids loved when Sarah called because she always had fun and fantastic stories to share with them. Eventually, I couldn't stand being apart anymore. I flew back to London and asked Sarah to be my wife. She, of course, accepted. Then we went to speak with her father, whom I learned was the Duke of Starling. Sarah's mother had passed away several years earlier. The Duke of Starling, or Percy, as he asked his friends and family to call him, lived on the family estate. The house was enormous, and the grounds were vast. Sarah explained that the estate's farming operations covered most of the expenses, but not all. To bridge the gap, the Duke opened the family home for public tours, which provided more than enough income to live comfortably. "So, you want to marry my little Sarah?" the Duke asked with a smile. "Yes, sir, very much," I replied. "You know her brother Edward will inherit the title and the estate?" he asked, as if to gauge my reaction. "None of your children will inherit a title. Sir, let me assure you, I don't care whether Sarah has a title or not," I replied with a smile. "I love her and want to make her happy. I know she would be very happy if you gave us your blessing. However, with or without it, I intend to marry Sarah if she agrees to marry me." The Duke laughed heartily. "Excellent answer. You have my blessing, with all my love." The wedding was modest, though larger than I would have preferred, with about 100 attendees, including the King and Queen. Peter also attended with a charming young lady. Now a teenager, Peter was expected to marry soon and produce an heir. My father was my best man, and both of my children were part of the ceremony. Sarah and I spent our honeymoon in Bermuda before flying back to the UK. We decided to live in England during the school year and in America during the summer holidays. Grant and Louise enrolled at Ludgrove, a school many royal families chose for their children. Sarah formally adopted Grant and Louise, solidifying our blended family. While we lived in the UK, the Queen occasionally asked Sarah and me to attend royal functions. These included visiting hospitals, schools, or inaugurating new factories. We were always warmly received, though I was initially hesitant to participate. However, Sarah made these outings enjoyable, and she always found a way to reward me later that night in bed. Whether we were in the UK or the US, Peter stayed in touch with us, and whenever he visited the US on official trips, he wanted to stay with us. Unfortunately, his security team never allowed it due to safety concerns. Peter had grown from a scared little boy into a confident, dynamic, and charismatic young man. I couldn't have been prouder of him if he had been my own son. 2 years after our wedding, Sarah gave birth to a boy. She insisted on naming him Michael Jr. A year later, we had a daughter, Charlotte, and a year and a half after that, another son, Thomas, named after my father. Despite all the pain and horror we had experienced, my new life was wonderful. I felt truly happy. Now, as we approach our 5th wedding anniversary, we decided to celebrate with a special dinner and a show. I bought Sarah a gold necklace with 3 heart-shaped charms, each engraved with the names and birthdates of our children. I hope she likes it. That night, during dinner, Sarah told me she was pregnant again. We later had another daughter and named her Mary, in honor of my mother. She has Michael's eyes and his smile. I have to stop writing now, it's time to feed Mary. All I can do is give my best for my children, especially knowing that's what Michael would want me to do. God, give me strength. I still love him so much and miss him deeply.